record.
Can you undo that?
Welcome everybody. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes as to let everybody arrive. I can just see people are still coming in, so we'll start in just 1 minute. Okay, everyone, we will make a start because we've only got an hour. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the role of art in keeping civic space open. My name is Pippa Cooper and I'm the coordinator of the Human Rights Defender Hub at the Centre for Applied Human Rights at the University of York. This webinar, it's the first in the series that we're hosting on the Arctivism project. And just over a year ago, we sought collaborations of artists and activists responding to the implications of the COVID pandemic on human rights. And we originally funded 26 projects in 21 countries. And in a recent collaboration with ActionAid, we've funded a further 12. These projects use all sorts of art forms, painting, song, drag performances, zines, theatre, and they address many human rights issues. So labour rights, Indigenous rights, the impact of the pandemic on the rights of women, environmental rights, as well as responses to authoritarianism and populism and thinking about new alternative futures. So the aim of these webinars is to explore the role that art can play in protecting human rights and especially to discuss the new ways of working and creating new solidarities and new collaborations that evolved in the Arctivism projects. So welcome to our panelists for this first webinar. We have Pamela Enyonu, who Pamela is there, but she's turned her camera off because of connectivity. So she is there. Pamela is a Ugandan-based visual artist and creative practitioner whose work explores narratives on gender, identity, and empowerment. And Pamela was recently a collaborating artist on our Development Alternatives project and also worked on a project with us on pushing back on resistance to restrictions on civic space. Rochelle Porras is a labour rights activist from the Philippines, a country with one of the worst records for labour rights in the world. And Rochelle works for the Ecumenical Institute for Labour Education and Research, and she led the Arctivism project ReImagining Resistance. Wezile Mgibe is a performance artist from South Africa whose work confronts prejudices and he advocates against social inequality, and in a recent project has focused on marginalisation and exclusion from public and social spaces. And his Arctivism project was the Politics of Displacement. So welcome to all our panelists. Chairing today's discussion is Emilie Flower, who's a participatory filmmaker and resident artist at the Centre for Applied Human Rights. Emilie has coordinated projects on development alternatives and creative activism, and is particularly interested in art, activism, and civic space. And Emilie recently conducted a research project and published a paper on pushing back on how human rights defenders and social movements have pushed back against restrictions on civic and democratic space. So welcome to our panelists and welcome to Emilie, and I will hand over to you to begin our discussion.
Thanks, Pippa. Hello to everyone. Thanks for being here. And hello to Rochelle, Wezile, and Pamela. I suppose we wanted to start just by finding out more about the projects that everyone's been involved in. So perhaps if I could come to you, Rochelle, and just ask you, what was the Arctivism project that you chose to do, and why did you choose to do that project?
Thank you, Emilie, and thank you, Pippa. I'm glad to be here. To quickly answer your question, we launched an online and a physical exhibit of what we entitled The Strike, Art Against Repression. It featured the artworks of trade union activists, cultural workers, labor rights defenders expressing the repression being experienced by workers in the Philippines. If I may share a screen, I will not play the entire video, but since this is a very visual medium, so it's better if you see it and experience it. So the Strike, Art Against Repression exhibit aimed to emphasize the relevance of art, its power to amplify the demands of the appeals of the workers against crisis and oppression. And we collected a total of 16 small artworks with varying media sizes. The main centerpiece is the 12 large-scale monochromatic photographs, where handwritten statements of the workers, by the workers, about their working conditions and their calls to actions were superimposed on the photographs. So you will see it in some of the pictures there. And then we launched an online exhibit after the physical one because we were limited on the time and the day that it can be open to the public. We held it in the middle of a demonstration as well on one of the most important days last November, which is the Global Day of Action Against Trade Union Repression in the Philippines. So that was our project. Thank you.
And how did you feel that it responded to the pandemic, this particular piece of work? How did it relate to what was going on in the Philippines during the pandemic?
Emilie, it was launched during the 30th of November, which was the Global Day of Action to stop trade union repression in the Philippines. And considering the pandemic and the extreme lockdown, if you haven't heard, the Philippines has one of the longest running lockdowns in the world, if not the longest running lockdown in the world. So people, due to the inaction of the government, were very committed to go and join protests and demonstrations in the streets, and specifically on the call of the against trade union repression in the Philippines. So amid the COVID-19 pandemic, amid the extreme lockdown and repression, people took part. People from different organizations took part in the protest and also joined our viewing. They were able to take a lot of pictures, post it on social media. And I think it is because the exhibition was made accessible to the masses who normally would not have the opportunity to visit a museum or a gallery. And it's also held during a critical time in the Philippines last year.
Great. Well, we'll probably come back to that, Rochelle, because it raises quite a few questions, doesn't it, about protest during lockdowns. But perhaps we could hear, Wezile, more about the project that you decided to do and why you chose to do that project, and I suppose how that responded to the pandemic as well, in particular.
Hi, Pamela. Oh, hey, everyone. It's nice to be here connecting virtually. I took a project that was already ongoing, but initially we were focusing on the concept of don't trust the border. We were like interrogating the dynamics, the displacement issue. And when lockdown came in, it kind of raised a lot of questions of, as much as we are dealing with displacement between nations and countries, but also there is a displacement within our households, within us. And now the lockdown just came in and it made everybody to stay in one place. So now there's been a lot of raising questions of how one negotiates space within the space that they have. So there were a lot of emotional and physical trauma during the process of pandemic, which is something that we felt it was underlooked during that process, and the project focused on that.
So what did you, when you talk about displacement and displacement in space, I suppose, a little bit, can you just slightly flesh that out for us, because it's a big word, as it were?
Yeah, it is a big word, and it's also like a very big project, hence we have it ongoing. The focus now, while it was a pandemic, we were focusing on the spaces that we stay in, and how we negotiate all these spaces and how it affects us. Some of these places were closed and one is faced to be in this space. Maybe this is the space he or she was running away from. Now you have to face and those realities. And how does that affect you? How does that affect your surrounding, your mental health, So the focus was, how does one survive this pandemic through going through all these traumatic events and having to recall everything? Now the reality is like facing you. There's no retreat, or there's no time to go away from it. So being displaced in this place, So the project went to that direction. But initially the project was, it began when I was in Cape Town. We were just talking about this promised land or promised places, or how one leaves home and goes to another country for a job or whatever reasons. And at where you're at now, you find yourself making a living, getting married, or getting a stable job, and you have to create home there. And to all those foreign places, you have to now find a way of how you can make home. And now during pandemic is how you make home into the space that you are familiar with it, but not really familiar with it. And it's kind of very difficult, because physically you cannot tell the impact of it, but emotionally and mental, it's huge, and it's damaging a lot of people, and it's something that we felt that it needs to get a light or attention of what does pandemic does to us mentally and physically and emotionally.
Did you what kind of artwork did you actually make in the end from this project?
I made a documentary work, a video work, and some performative stills. But the most interesting part was the process of it, which is what I'm always focusing on, because I like to work with materials that have lived longer, because they create further conversations. And that is the work is about, is before we make the documentary, it was just us and everybody, which is talking of how one affected with the pandemic. And that process for me led to what people call it an end product, which is not really necessarily an end product, which is something that we would like to expand on different views and how people experience pandemic in different places. Mm-hmm. So we have a video work that is currently in showing in some of other spaces, but due to pandemic they closed. Yeah, but it's in one of the museums around here in South Africa. But it also did show in Portugal. Yeah, I think. Yes.
Great. I think process is also something that Pamela is really interested in. Pamela and I have worked on a few projects together. She didn't do the Arctivism project, but she was involved as a responding artist to the Art Archive and Activism project recently, and in the Pushing Back Civic Space project that we did. Pamela, although you didn't do an Arctivist project, what work did you choose to focus on during the pandemic? And did you find that your work was somehow trying to respond to that?
I think we were locked down at the tail end of the project we did with you at the Uganda Museum. In fact, as soon as we finished that, I think like a couple of days later, then we were locked down. And I remember I had some projects that were supposed to happen in the Netherlands and in Dakar. So for me, all that sort of for me. So I was in a slight state of panic for a bit, because as an artist, mobility for me facilitates my work. It makes sure that I get paid. So if I'm not moving or I'm not doing a different project, then I'm not getting paid. So that meant being grounded and having to think of alternative ways in which to survive. And I chose to focus on just keeping my mind busy. So I started painting again. I hadn't painted in 10 years. And I started relearning that particular skill of painting. And I did that throughout the whole pandemic. So the very first painting that I did was responding to all the loneliness that the pandemic seemed to amplify for me, because I was lucky that I was sheltering at home with family, but I knew people who were sheltering alone by themselves abroad or in another part of the district. And I used to take like the things we do socially for granted, you know, the human touch of going to the club and dancing and drinking with friends. And all of that seemed to be restricted or taken away, because while introverts seem to be having a good time, but extroverts were suffering because they needed the energy of other people around them. So the very first painting I did, unfortunately, I did not share the artwork, but the very first day, hugging the jacket of their loved one, because it seemed that in that moment, the things that they already have, like the clothes, the shoes, were representative of the presence that they missed. That's the piece that I worked on in that moment. It was the only piece that I did responding to the pandemic very directly, but also it was the first painting that I did after 10 years of not painting.
And have you, that's quite a sort of, in a way, it's quite a personal take. And I know there are a lot of other Arctivist projects that were thinking about this kind of support for other artists. And one aspect of that project was a sort of well-being thread. A lot of people were doing work to sort of support each other. I was wondering whether you had produced any work that was, in a sense, a sort of more of a pushback against the lockdown, or, you know, against the kind of shrinking civic space. Yeah, I mean, it may be that you haven't, you know, got to the point where you would want to yet. I don't know. So did you find yourself producing more kind of, I don't know, responsive work to the actual situation in terms of the way it was being managed and the shrinking space, or not? Pamela.
Let me try and examine. I think last year was a bit Can you hear me? Because I may be suffering some connection.
Yeah.
Last year, we were preparing for an election, because at the end of last year, campaigns for elections started. And then people were actively using social media to campaign, but our government, being that it's full of old men and old people, were not as savvy as the younger opponent, who was Bobby Wine. So what happened in that moment, that even those avenues to use the internet were sort of locked down, because Twitter was locked down, WhatsApp was locked down, Facebook was locked down, and Instagram was locked down for a bit. So the whole of that time, in addition to us trying to manage the pandemic, we were trying not to get arbitrarily arrested by the government for any inappropriate, it's called, we have a Computer Act. It's a very vague act here in Uganda, so it can be interpreted in any way if you say something of dissent to the government. So I think a lot of the young people, or rather us artists, were wondering whether to focus on the pandemic and what it was doing to us personally, or be involved in the political situation that was extremely, extremely violent. Some of our colleagues were arrested and being picked up from homes and driven to unknown locations. Some are still there. So as an artist, I was, I think, a bit depressed. I did not know what exactly I wanted to talk about, because I was like, okay, yeah, I have no food, but also people are dying. They're being beaten on the street. And it was a very difficult thing for me. So I started to write poems, which I'm still working on, and develop a project that hopefully will see the day of light. Because in that moment, I was not even thinking about the logistics or trying to have a proper project. It was basically responding to what was going on around me in a way that I could. And writing was the only way I could, so I started to write.
Yeah, and that's a kind of slow moving process. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about using different forms for different kinds of comments. And I think we should return to that. I wonder if, Rochelle, you mentioned earlier that you produced the exhibition outside, and it was during the lockdown, and it was linked to a protest. So I can imagine that had some sensitivities associated with it. I mean, how was that exhibition received by the broader audience, but also more generally in relation to it being a lockdown?
Yes, it's like what you said, a way to also push back against the restrictions imposed during the lockdowns. And in particular, when we talk about trade unions and workers' organizations, amid the pandemic, in spite of the lockdowns and the closure of many factories or offices, and then a temporary halt also in negotiations and collective bargaining agreements. The lockdowns have raised a lot of suspension and temporary delays in the implementation of certain guidelines, or has also suspended some of our rights, technically speaking, but the people can no longer be a victim of that. So on November 30th, that particular year, last year, also marks the 4th time in the Philippines. Now this year, the 5th time in a row that we are included in the top 10 worst countries for workers in the world, a ranking made by the ITUC 2021 Global Rights Index. The Philippines is also considered the deadliest country for indigenous people, which makes it also the deadliest country for land rights defenders. And since President Duterte took office in 2016, there have been about 300 documented killings of peasants, farm workers, fisher folk, and we are also well documented in the world as being the deadliest country for journalists. And the passing also of this very specific act, the Anti-Terror Act of 2020, what we now call the terror law, worsened the situation. So the Anti-Terror Act of 2020 perpetrated red tagging or the branding of many organizations, trade unions, including as communist, and connecting them with terrorism as if the two are one and the same. And then this kind of vilification, labeling, it poses incalculable dangers to the people, especially for activist and progressive organizations. Hence, the people wanted to push back against this repressive laws and guidelines and policies that are being implemented. And one way that we can see that we can contribute to the demands of the people is to amplify their voices by collating artworks that also tries to show the struggles and the challenges that the workers, trade union organizers are facing on the ground.
And what was the audience response to that exhibition?
Mixed reaction. I would say that one thing, it's quite inspiring. As I've said earlier, and as you've probably seen in the video, the central pieces have handwritten notes from the workers expressing their conditions, their legitimate demands, or their call for the government or their fellow workers. And some were also delighted because they got to see curated artworks in a space that is a ground for protesting also. It was held in the University of the Philippines, one of the places of protest during the pandemic. And finally, also, I think it brings a kind of hope amid the pandemic, because everyone was on a lockdown, and around the time of the year, it was one of the biggest mobilizations also, and people were gathered to collectively call for better response from the government. And what better way to amplify that call and than to express it in the form of art, something that anyone and ordinary people can also relate to, especially the workers that we included in the central pieces, the 12 big central pieces. Some of them also went there, took their pictures beside the artwork with their handwritten notes. So it was something like to see, very inspiring, and at the same time, it's also, it reminds you of the kind of closing of civic spaces that you're experiencing right now, because to hold an exhibit in that context also poses risk and amid the pandemic. And we are very happy that people observe physical distancing, wore proper masks and face shields. So you would see that the protesters and those who viewed the exhibit were very disciplined, followed the safety protocols. But again, the bigger part is that they were able to push back against state repression in a way that is also safe for considering the health situation that we're facing right now.
Did you, Rochelle, just to follow up, did you find that there was that working with artists enabled you to do something with your protest or campaigning that you wouldn't be able to do normally? How did you find working with artists on this campaign?
They were very receptive, and they expressed their full support. We were able to easily gather a dozen of artists and a total of 16 artworks from them. And at the same time, not only the artists but also the workers participated in the exhibit. So I think it's because the central theme of the exhibit resonates on the common experiences that everyone was facing at the time. The heightened restrictions on what Pamela was saying when it comes also to mobility and access to certain services. Everyone was just fed up with the inaction or the failed responses of the government. And I think the theme was able to unite the artists and the workers towards a common goal, which is to express the legitimate demands of the workers for better responses amid the pandemic.
Wezile, did you, in your project, you mentioned that process was really important. And so I imagine there were a lot of conversations. Maybe it was perhaps a slightly less didactic approach, as I know that Rochelle's approach has a very, so it has a very clear banner that goes underneath and a clear campaign that work attaches to. Perhaps your work is based on a more discursive approach to opening space, a less direct way of challenging shrinking civic space. I wonder how you found working. Did you work with activists as well? Who did you talk to in order to develop that project, and what was that experience and that collaboration like?
Okay, for me, I work with another artist who using a different medium as me, and for the term of activist, for me, it was the people around, yes, because they always have a voice and all that, and those are the ones that really were projecting the work and directing it, which position or which angle should we present it, because they really mattered. Because those are the people that I've worked with them, and also the artists were a photographer and a filmmaker. So we just sat around and I guess I gave him a right to also express himself in a way that he knows best. And the whole collaboration, it's still actually going on. It's an ongoing collaboration. It was not like a one-off thing. And I guess we had a platform to voice out the opinions or anything one wanted to voice in any way. And it did not only include an artist, but it include everybody, an everyday person, because I like to believe we all somehow artists, we express our ways in different ways. We like constantly performing our lives and and all that. So it was great for me to give anyone a platform to say anything, to feel valued, which is it was one of the key on my practices, that everyone deserves to give given a chance, to value their lives. And it was like a thing of, okay, here's a pandemic. It's such a huge subject that one cannot deal with it by themselves. But what else, or what we can do, to make things seem or to look better or find a way to survive, So it was those kind of conversations that were going around.
Mm. And did you manage to get any feedback on the piece? Were you able to be anywhere where you could see audience reaction or speak to people about the piece, or did you get?
Oh yeah. Actually, the audience, the reactions were very kind of different. And another thing, it was a language barrier sometimes, but it was very interesting because in South Africa we have like different kinds of languages, and I was like, I open a space when somebody can just express themselves in their home language and all that. But there was so much frustration in terms of like, it was not conducted as like an interview, question and answers. We were just talking how frustrated everybody is, and how one will be like, oh, now I have to deal with this situation, which is the situations I've pointed prior of how much of a huge things that we have, but we're not really talking about. And that the pandemic made them, gave them a seat at the table, that actually, as much as we are facing the COVID, there is a lot that we are facing that now will be influenced by a pandemic. So the reaction was very, it was very personal. It was very emotional. And I think most of them needed to get a place where they can express themselves, knowing that in these days, it's very difficult for one to really speak up about anything, even to people that they very close to them. So having a key or having a space where you can truly be yourself and speak what matters to you, it was really empowering for me.
And did you feel that the use of art brought something? Did people say that using anything particularly had enabled them to voice some of their concerns or created conversations they might not have had otherwise?
I'm not sure if I
Yeah.
get you part. I think after those conversations, you know, people realize how art can be used as a tool for coping mechanism. Like it's like art was one of the few mediums or one of the few things people can use at home, which is you were locked down. Now you realize the impact of art, what it does to people and to human beings. So now they had an ear to really pay such respect or acknowledge art that, you know, it is an activity or it is a tool or medium that it can really help us in any way, socially, economically, in any way as we continue living. And they didn't know that on their daily basis, actually more of the things were responded through art. So the conversations really revealed a lot of things and the importance of art in our spaces.
Pamela, you've done quite a lot of work with activists now,
Yes,
and people who even define themselves as activists.
Yes.
What's your experience of collaborating with them, and how does it impact your work, or has it impacted your work?
One of the things I enjoy about working with activists is because they've got access to information, statistics, numbers, policies. So you may have an idea, but you don't know if it's real or imagined. But by working with activists and this organizations they've done this research, they've done statistics, so your ideas or your concepts again as real information on the ground. And one of the
We may have lost Pamela for a moment. I think we have. We'll never know the answer to that question. She may be back in a minute. But in the meantime, maybe I could just ask you, Rochelle. Oh, Pamela, you're back.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you now. We
so
lost you just for a moment.
Where did you lose me at? Because I didn't notice.
I think you were just telling us well, about collaborations that you've done with activists. You said that one thing was that you don't know sometimes whether something is imagined or not, and so they actually have facts at their fingertips. But I think then you were moving on to another point.
Yes, what I enjoy or rather like about working with activists is because they also have access to certain spaces I'm interested in, but not necessarily open to me as, say, an artist from a different region who speaks a different language. But when you work with these activists or these activist organizations, they've already earned the trust of the people and the community in which they work in. So you can have like a first-hand, first-person experience when working with them, because then you get to listen to stories that have happened to real people, and it's like a wealth of information for you as an artist, and also to check your own biases and things like that. So I absolutely like that about working with activists.
And do you find that it in any way, you've said it kind of boosts your work, but does it ever compromise your work?
Yes, in many ways, because most organizations obviously have I don't want to call it an agenda because it's not a word we like, but they've got, and they answer to their funders in most cases. And so sometimes there's this almost undercurrent of, this is what the end result should look like, and it should not offend XYZ. Sometimes they don't want to, or rather we don't want to confront the idea that some of these funders are the perpetrators of the violence that we see around us. They are the instruments of capitalism and oppression. And we don't want to confront that. And if, say, as an artist, your work sort of is at the intersection of all these issues, you may find yourself having to either edit or find I don't know, another way, or even sometimes not even do the work at all, because if you don't feel it will be true and authentic, you may just abandon the whole project.
It's true. Rochelle, you were nodding. Did you did you feel there was some response to that as well?
I relate to what Pamela was saying when it comes, for example, responding to the demands of your donors. It makes it also very tricky for us, a labor nonprofit organization, because we do not access funds, for example, simply from corporations that have, perpetrated violations against violations and exploitation against workers. So I'm just appreciative of the fact that also artists has to go through the same kind of analyzing the impact of whom you engage with and the principles behind the engagement. So I'm very happy to know that, and that kind of work is indeed very respectful and dignified, and I think it gives the end viewer or the end user of the medium or the art that you're making a kind of deeper appreciation and meaning to the principles behind it as well.
Did you find there were any challenges to working with artists or compromises to your work or your message?
I think it's not really a challenge, but kind of finding the middle ground or the common ground, the common goal, the collective action that you can take on to both use the art and express the message that you wanted. I mean, we were able to invite various artists from different backgrounds, and the way that we see it is that they're united against, the very central theme of the exhibit itself, against trade union repression. So if we're able to find either the minimum or the maximum issue, a people's issue or a local issue that both artists and activists and civil society organizations can work on, I think it becomes less of a challenge and more of an exercise of finding the unity that you can build upon.
Yeah. Is Wezile, I wonder if you could, just moving on to the whole question of how civic space has been impacted by the pandemic in your context. I just wondered whether you could tell us just more broadly how you think civic space has been impacted, and just how artists around you have been responding to that specific situation in South Africa. It's quite a big question.
Yeah. I'm actually looking at it in both ways, because we currently have a pandemic and also there's currently something happening in South Africa. So it's been very difficult. I think one, we have been challenged as artists on how we present work and how we produce work, and but also that limits us in terms of internet and all that, and there's a lot of exclusion now. Again, we're going back to how art now look as an exclusive medium for everyone, which is something that I'm sure, one, we didn't want to, because we want everybody to have access in it. So the pandemic is kind of forcing us to go back to that road, because few people can see the work online and have access to technology and all that. But most of the artists are trying to produce work where the public can access them, but not at the same time. For me, I've been doing a lot of curational works and installations just to adhere to all the rules and all that. But it's been quite a hectic time. Personally, an artist have to take care of themselves, and the work is not moving. And also, how do you produce work for everyone to see? So there's a lot of challenges that are going through, and now the public and everyone is our aim. We've been trying to produce work to the public so they have a sense of that it belongs to them, it's part of them, and art, it is part of who they are. They can engage with it in any way. And now the pandemic is saying otherwise, and it is quite a very tough challenge. But I will say that there is sculptures. I mean, public art does like a lot of things to the space, you know, to the environment, I mean, to the economy, to all that. But again, we're in a space where we cannot practice such things. So how are we doing now? I think now the artists in South Africa, they're just trying to find their ground in terms of able to sustain their practice, you know, and most of them, they not want to go through the route of producing work online.
Sorry, I know that you do quite a lot of performative work usually, wouldn't you? And you'd do work that was actually in person. Have you been able to do any of that kind of public work?
Oh, I was supposed to like a week ago, and then I think a week or 2 weeks ago, and then the president said, mentioned the lockdown, that they, you know, so we were forced not to be able to do a performance. And I think it's so frustrating because you want to do a performance so bad and you cannot. But again, it's also a challenge of how can I do it in a way that will adhere to the rules and all that, you know. As I say, we in a space now where we have to negotiate in ways of how to do things. We are just constantly negotiating living now. And yeah. I think one thing that the pandemic teaches us as everybody is how we should have looked everything before the pandemic. You know, there's a lot of things that were close to pandemic, we didn't keep an eye on it. It's just that reality, it came to everybody at the same time. We're like, stop everything, here I am. And it just reminds us of humanity and how we have to, you know, find a way to coexist with our spaces and our environments. And yeah.
So would it be an exaggeration for me to say that you're saying, in a sense, that it's not so much that civic space has closed, but that the pandemic has revealed that civic space was more closed than people realized?
Yes.
Something like that.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that have been revealed. You know, there's a lot of things that now people actually miss and they never take into account, and those things were influenced by art. You know.
And how were they influenced by art? What role do you think that art, I suppose that's that next question about what role do you think that art plays in keeping civic space open? Do you think it has a role in that respect?
Yeah, I am actually trying to, you know, think at how the role of art, you know, it does like there's a history behind it, there's an information behind it, you know. It's not like one going to the library and reading a long book, but a one artwork can really reveal a lot of things. You know, there's a lot of learning and unlearning through art. So the contribution of it is just unlimited, you know. And I think this is now the time where people are actually revisiting all those things, you know, and they're actually paying attention to that.
Can art talk about things that in a way that nobody else can talk about them sometimes, or is it just that it makes people think in a different way? Do you have an opinion on that? I mean, it's rather a broad question, but you might.
Personally, for me, even in my practice, I just create work to create further conversations. You know, I don't want you to think in this specific way, but I just put the subject out there to create further conversations, you know. think in a different ways, but of course they are working, on your face, and they force one to really talk about such subjects, like there was a lot of structures that were taken down in South Africa in Grahamstown and in Cape Town, so there's been a lot of history, that
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I didn't catch that.
Sorry,
Could you
guys.
try again?
I think it's my recording. I don't know what's going on. It's my phone is on. I'm sorry. So there's a lot of things that
Fine.
Yes,
I'm not sure I understand.
But that's all right, because you can
My
say it
phone is
again and then they will.
No, I've just switched it on. My phone is connected to yeah. So yeah, there's a lot. Now I've just missed what I was trying to say according with art and history. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think you were saying a really important thing that a lot of artists say, and sometimes it seems difficult to capture, but the conversations are really, really important for you, that people have as a result of your work. So your work ignites conversations, and that.
Yeah. I think yeah, and I think that's the whole meaning of making art. It's another way of expressing views, different views. It's another way of study. It's another academic way of expressing things that is art. It shouldn't be something that we looked at it and then the next morning we moved on into it. It's something that we should reflect or apply it, use it as a method or an equation or something, to apply it, So I think that's how art should be.
Yeah. Pamela, you're nodding. Do you? I guess the question started with, what's happened to civic space during the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Pamela. Are you there?
No, I was really feeling what he was saying, because for us, as he's mentioned, that the pandemic thought, but what I've liked to coming out of the pandemic, and for us, I feel like the elections and the violence during the elections during a pandemic was a much bigger story than the pandemic. And because we do not have, I don't know if we have any historians in my country that would bravely record some of the atrocities that are happening, but artists found a way to document this and share their work for free on the internet, and for us to see. There were skits, and Ugandans are using, or rather artists and Ugandans are using humor to sort of go through the trauma of this time. So there's a lot of funny skits on the internet that are critiquing how the government, first of all, handled the pandemic, how Ugandans rallied behind the government at the beginning to raise funds to donate towards building up our hospitals, and then the government used that money for elections. So we didn't see where there is nothing else we have but our voices and our humor. So a lot of work was produced that, one, documented the times, two, allowed us to laugh about our very terrible situation, and three, also provoked the government into responding to some of the critique that was coming out from these different avenues.
Yeah. So could the artists say things because of the way in which they said it that other people couldn't?
Yes, because we are also a very polite society as Ugandans, so we don't confront things directly. So things are layered in metaphor, and art is an excellent tool for you to layer a huge amount of information in a metaphor or in an image, and we will get it, the government will get it, but there's no direct way to arrest somebody for saying it.
Yeah. So would you say in that way it actually helps to open space, or does it just provide alternative spaces for people to talk about things?
Yes.
Rochelle, do you
Opened up another space that we had, because you guys probably.
hello? We have you. Can you hear us?
Hello? Okay.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yes, I was saying that the online space was not a space that we had fully utilized. One, because also internet in Uganda is one of the most expensive, at least in East Africa. So the online space is still very much, as Wezile mentioned, a very exclusionary space. We've got about 10 million mobile users in this country, a country of about 45 million people. So the online space has always been left to people of a certain class or certain social category. But during the pandemic, through these online channels, because televisions, radios were heavily censored, and because we found access and ways to use VPNs to go to overtake some of these barriers that the government had put up earlier. So a lot of us were receiving news and information directly to our WhatsApp, directly to our WhatsApp. So you'd find that there was a lot of what we call citizen journalism, recording of all what was happening and being shared via WhatsApp.
Yeah. Yes, so it was a real change in the forms that you were using. Rochelle, have you seen any similar changes? Have you seen what's happened to civic space during the pandemic? And you mentioned some things earlier in the Philippines, but how have artists around you been responding that? Have you seen other responses other than your exhibition? And what role do you think that art is playing?
Yes, there have been many artists and activists doing collaborative work, giving voices to the marginalized. And I think what Wezile and Pamela is saying is also quite evident in the way how Filipino people, Filipino artists in particular, and the progressive artists also are working towards expressing, you know, the demands of the people and the suffering of the people, and how particular events, for example, are being mainstreamed. When I say mainstream, it's because, for example, the political killings of trade unionists, you don't always get that on your regular news feed. So art and artists play a critical role in also mainstreaming national and local issues that are all most of the time left unreported and undiscussed in the context of closing civic spaces. And I think also that activities like these that involves art opens avenues for further discussions on issues in general, and in social justice, in the context of social justice in general. Artists that produce works within societies can also promote, for example, people's collective rights, and help amplify the rights of the people in time of extreme suppression of these rights. So, for example, the rights of the fundamental rights of workers when it comes to freedom of association, collective bargaining rights, social dialogues, etc. Art and art making can help reopen this shrinking civic space, and ultimately also provide ways for people to engage and for better democratic participation of the general public as well.
I think we've got 1 minute left, so that might be quite a good place to leave it, since it's quite, well, it's quite a positive place to leave it in terms of the role, the potential perhaps that art can have. I wanted to ask you lots more about that, but I'll have to do that at another time. And so thank you very much, Pamela, Wezile and Rochelle. I think we had a real kind of diversity of experience as well amongst you, which was really useful and rich. And I'll hand back to Pippa for closing remarks.
Thank you, Emilie, and thank you everyone for such an interesting discussion and for sharing your insights and your experiences and telling us about how you've been coping during the pandemic. So thank you, Wezile, Rochelle and Pamela, and thank you, Emilie, for moderating for us today. Thank you everyone for joining us. I know we are out of time, but hopefully you'll be able to join us in other webinars. Like I said at the beginning, this is the first in a series, and we have other webinars coming up throughout the year. The next one is on hope in September, and then we have webinars on extractivism and the future of care, so do look out for those. Also, today's webinar is being recorded, so we will make that available and online, and also we would like to publish this as a paper, so look out for those. So that's it. I think we're finishing spot on 1 o'clock, so thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Stay safe.
Everybody.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Lovely to see you.
Sure.